Here's the truth no one tells you in the middle of the silence. A marriage doesn't die from one conversation, and it doesn't have to end in one either. Let's continue to uncover many things. The conversation that ends a marriage usually doesn't happen at the kitchen table. It doesn't begin with divorce papers. It doesn't begin with an affair. It doesn't begin with someone packing a suitcase. And it doesn't begin with the words, "We need to talk." Most of the time, the conversation that ends a marriage happened months, sometimes years, before anyone realized it was happening. That's what makes it so dangerous. Because when people imagine the end of a marriage, they imagine an event, a moment, a crisis, a decision. But relationships rarely die that way. Most marriages die the same way a house develops structural damage. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. A crack here, a leak there, a little neglect, a little distance, a little resentment. Nothing that seems urgent in the moment. Nothing that feels large enough to destroy something important. Until one day the damage becomes impossible to ignore. And everyone acts surprised, even though the warning signs had been sitting in plain sight for years. That's what I want to talk about today. Because the conversation that quietly ends marriages isn't one conversation. It's hundreds of them. It's every conversation that never got finished. Every feeling that never got expressed. Every apology that never happened. Every concern that got dismissed. Every disappointment that got stored away instead of resolved. And eventually, all of those unfinished conversations accumulate, like emotional debt. And just like financial debt, emotional debt collects interest. The longer it remains unpaid, the more expensive it becomes. Most people think marriages end when love disappears. I don't believe that. I've seen too many couples prove otherwise. I think marriages often end when hope disappears, because people can survive conflict. People can survive mistakes. People can survive hardship. People can survive disappointment. But very few relationships survive hopelessness. And hopelessness rarely arrives overnight. It arrives one ignored conversation at a time, one dismissed feeling at a time, one unresolved argument at a time, one lonely evening at a time, until eventually one person looks at the other and realizes something frightening. They're no longer talking to be understood. They're talking because they feel obligated to, or worse, they've stopped talking altogether. And when that happens, something begins changing inside a relationship. Not loudly, quietly. The most dangerous changes in marriage are usually quiet. You see, anger isn't actually the beginning of the end. Anger is still emotionally invested. Anger still believes something can change. Anger still hopes somebody is listening. That's why angry people argue. That's why they raise concerns. That's why they complain. They're trying to save something. They're trying to be heard. The truly dangerous stage begins when someone stops trying to be heard, when frustration becomes resignation, when disappointment becomes acceptance, when someone decides, nothing I say is going to matter anyway, and once a person reaches that conclusion, their behavior starts changing. At first, it's subtle. The complaints become less frequent. The conversations become shorter. The effort becomes smaller. And because the fighting decreases, the other partner often assumes things are improving. That's one of the greatest tragedies in long-term relationships. Sometimes the absence of conflict is not evidence of peace. It's evidence of surrender. I've seen wives celebrate the exact moment they should have become concerned. The husband stopped complaining, stopped bringing things up, stopped asking for changes, stopped arguing, stopped expressing frustration, and she thinks, finally, things are better. But what she doesn't understand is that his silence may not be peace. His silence may be grief. There is a specific kind of grief that comes from feeling unheard for too long. It's the grief of realizing that the conversations you thought mattered don't seem to matter to the person you're having them with. And eventually, people adapt. Human beings are incredibly adaptive. If touching a hot stove burns you enough times, you stop touching it. Relationships work the same way. If vulnerability repeatedly leads to disappointment, people stop being vulnerable. If honesty repeatedly leads to criticism, people stop being honest. If asking repeatedly leads to rejection, people stop asking. Not because the need disappeared, because the pain became stronger than the hope. And this is where many marriages begin drifting into dangerous territory. Because once people stop expressing their needs, those needs don't disappear. They simply go underground. And needs that go underground often reappear as resentment. That resentment then starts showing up everywhere, not in dramatic ways, in ordinary ways. Two people sitting on the same couch but living in different worlds. Two people sharing a bed but not sharing their thoughts. Two people discussing schedules, bills, children, groceries, repairs, while avoiding every conversation that actually matters. The marriage continues functioning, but the relationship stops growing. And many people confuse functioning with healthy. Those are not the same thing. A marriage can function for years after emotional intimacy has disappeared. People can successfully run a household together long after they've stopped truly knowing one another. That's why so many divorces shock friends and family. The marriage looks stable from the outside. The bills were paid. The children were cared for. The vacations still happened. The holiday photos still got posted. Everything looked normal. Except the relationship had been slowly starving for years. And starvation is rarely dramatic. It's gradual. That's what makes it difficult to recognize. One of the earliest signs is not what people say. It's what they stop saying. A husband used to tell his wife about his day. Now he says, "It was fine." A wife used to tell her husband what was bothering her. Now she says, "Nothing." Not because nothing is wrong, because she no longer believes the conversation will lead anywhere useful. And when people stop sharing their inner world with one another, the marriage begins losing oxygen. You cannot remain deeply connected to someone who no longer knows what's happening inside you. That's impossible. Connection requires access, and many marriages slowly become relationships where both people are living private lives inside a shared house. Be honest in the comments. Have you ever felt this? Have you ever sat beside someone you loved and felt completely alone? I think a lot more people understand that feeling than they're willing to admit. Another thing I've noticed is that body language often starts saying goodbye long before words do. People stop reaching for each other. The hand on the shoulder disappears. The hug becomes shorter. The kiss becomes routine. The eye contact fades. The spontaneous affection that once felt effortless starts feeling rare. Nobody announces it. Nobody says, "Starting today, I'm going to feel less connected." It just happens, little by little, month by month, year by year, until one day you realize the person you used to run toward has become the person you simply live beside. And that realization hurts, because most people can remember exactly when things were different. They remember the phone calls that lasted for hours, the laughter, the flirting, the excitement, the feeling that this person was your safe place. And that's why emotional distance is so painful. You're not just losing what exists today. You're grieving what used to exist too. One of the saddest questions I've ever heard in a marriage wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was asked quietly, almost like the person was afraid of the answer. They asked, "Do you even like me anymore?" Think about that question. Not love. Like, because there comes a point in some marriages where people stop wondering whether they're loved. They start wondering whether they're even enjoyed, whether their presence still brings comfort, whether their voice still matters, whether they're still wanted. And those questions don't appear randomly. They appear after years of experiences that made someone feel unseen, ignored, unimportant. Replace enough moments of connection with moments of disappointment, and eventually people begin questioning everything, including their place in the relationship. If someone you love is still asking difficult questions, don't dismiss them. Difficult questions are often signs that hope is still alive. People who have completely given up rarely ask questions anymore. They stop asking because they've already decided the answer. And that's when marriages become truly vulnerable. Another thing that quietly ends marriages is substitution. People don't always leave relationships physically. Sometimes they leave emotionally. And when they do, they usually replace intimacy with something else. Work, phones, television, social media, hobbies, friends, fitness, projects, anything that fills the emotional space where connection used to live. And the dangerous thing is that most of these substitutes look harmless. Working isn't bad. Exercise isn't bad. Friendships aren't bad. The problem happens when those things become your primary source of relief instead of your spouse. Because eventually people start sharing their thoughts, dreams, frustrations, and emotional energy everywhere except the relationship. And once that happens, The marriage slowly becomes a place of logistics rather than intimacy. Have you ever noticed that? A relationship where every conversation becomes about responsibilities, bills, schedules, children, appointments, groceries, repairs, deadlines, life management. Everything except the actual relationship. And after enough time, two people become excellent business partners, excellent parents, excellent roommates, but no longer feel like lovers, no longer feel like best friends, no longer feel like the people who once couldn't wait to spend time together. That's why so many arguments are never really about what they're about. The dishes aren't about dishes. The money isn't about money. The text message isn't about the text message. The real argument is usually hidden underneath. It's about respect. It's about feeling prioritized. It's about feeling appreciated. It's about feeling chosen. It's about feeling seen. When a wife says, "You never help around here," sometimes what she's really saying is, "I don't feel supported." When a husband says, "You never want to spend time with me," sometimes what he's really saying is, "I don't feel important to you anymore." The problem is that couples spend years arguing about the surface issue, while the real issue remains untouched. And problems that remain unnamed cannot be solved. They simply continue growing. Then something else happens. Arguments stop getting repaired. This is where many marriages quietly begin dying. Not because people argue. Every couple argues. Healthy couples argue. The difference is what happens afterward. Years ago, couples would fight, then talk, then reconnect, then repair. But in struggling marriages, repair disappears. The argument ends, but the hurt remains. The conversation stops, but the resentment stays. The tension cools, but nothing gets resolved. And eventually both people begin carrying emotional debt they never intended to carry. One unresolved hurt becomes 10. 10 becomes 50. 50 becomes years of accumulated disappointment. And then one day a simple disagreement triggers emotions that have nothing to do with the current situation. People think they're arguing about today's problem. They're actually arguing about 5 years of unresolved pain. Have you ever experienced that? Be honest. Did you ever realize halfway through an argument that you weren't really upset about today's issue? You were upset about everything that came before it. That's what unresolved hurt does. It compounds, just like interest on a loan. And eventually, it becomes overwhelming. Then the language changes. The word "we" begins disappearing. People start saying, "my money, my plans, my future, my goals," without even realizing it. And that's important because language reveals thought. When people stop thinking like a team, they stop speaking like a team. The emotional separation often begins long before the physical separation. And then comes one of the most dangerous stages of all. Contempt, not anger. Contempt. Contempt is different. Anger says, "I'm upset with you." Contempt says, "I'm above you." And marriages rarely survive contempt for long. Eye-rolling, mocking, belittling, sarcasm, embarrassing your partner in public, treating their feelings as ridiculous, treating their concerns as weaknesses. These things are corrosive, because nobody can remain emotionally open with someone who consistently makes them feel small. Respect is oxygen in a marriage. Take it away, and the relationship begins suffocating. Eventually, a private conversation starts happening inside someone's mind. And this is where things become heartbreaking, because the person may still be physically present, but emotionally, they're already somewhere else. They're imagining life alone, wondering what separation would look like, thinking about what peace might feel like, questioning whether anything can actually change. And often, nobody knows this is happening. Not friends, not family, not even the spouse, because these conversations happen silently, in the privacy of someone's own thoughts, until eventually one day they reach a conclusion, not out loud, internally. And that internal decision usually sounds something like this: "I'm done trying." Not done loving, done trying. And those are not the same thing. Some people still love their spouse when they reach that point, but they no longer believe effort will change anything. And that's what makes it so tragic, because the actual divorce conversation often comes much later. By the time someone finally says, "We need to talk," the real conversation has already happened. The loneliness happened. The disappointment happened. The withdrawal happened. The grief happened. The decision happened. The announcement is simply catching up to what the heart already decided months or years earlier. That's why those conversations often sound strangely calm. The emotion was already spent. The tears were already cried. The arguments were already had. The hope was already exhausted. And now all that's left is acceptance. That's the conversation that quietly ends marriages. Not one moment, thousands of moments. Not one decision, hundreds of small decisions. Not one argument, years of unfinished ones. And if you're listening today, I want you to remember something. If your spouse is still talking to you about what's wrong, there is still hope. If they're still expressing frustration, there is still hope. If they're still trying to explain themselves, there is still hope. The dangerous moment isn't when people fight. The dangerous moment is when they stop believing the fight matters. So listen, ask questions, stay curious, stay humble, have the difficult conversation. Don't wait until silence replaces honesty. Don't wait until distance replaces connection. Don't wait until resignation replaces hope. Because the conversation that quietly ends a marriage rarely begins with divorce. It begins when two people slowly stop having the conversations that could have saved it. And now I'd like to hear from you. What warning sign did you recognize first? Was it silence? Distance? Resentment? The loss of intimacy? The disappearance of we? Or was it something else entirely? Share your story in the comments. Read through the comments too. You may discover that you're not nearly as alone as you think. And if this conversation spoke to you, like the video, subscribe to Relationship Reality and turn on notifications. Because sometimes the truth that hurts us today is the truth that protects us tomorrow. I'm David, and after 40 years of watching relationships succeed and fail, I've learned one lesson I'll never forget. Marriages rarely end when someone leaves. Do not let yours to end in a careless way. Most marriages end long before that. The day two people stop believing they can reach each other's hearts anymore.